apologies. And I want to say that we've got more people present at the AGM than we had last year, which is now with 24 people. We're just ahead of that. So this is very good news indeed. And it's going to be my pleasure just now to welcome Professor Anthony Butler, who will talk on will Cyril Ramaphosa's second term have a more domestic or a more international orientation? Well, I should think, judging by what's going on in the metros at the moment, he's got a few domestic problems to sort out, apart from anything else. So it'll be interesting to hear what Professor Butler has to say about that. The next item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes. I'm not sure if we have these been seen by everyone.
Yes, they were sent.
And they were sent out, I'm told. And I mean, I got them, but everybody got them. So that's good. Has anybody got any points to raise on page 1, page 2, page 3? The minutes in order. Can somebody propose that we adopt them? Jeremy, thank you, Jeremy Wiley, and Mike Slicer. Thanks a lot. So, should I sign them? And it's the 23rd. The next item on our agenda is matters arising. Has anybody got anything to mention under this heading? No. Well, thanks. We can then move on to the presentation and adoption of, hopefully, of the annual report for 2021. And I apologize for not standing, but as it's a hybrid meeting, if I stand, I won't be in the picture. So we'll be sitting for this meeting, if you don't mind. So this is the report to our 2021 annual general meeting, and our activities in brief were as follows. At the end of my report to last year's AGM, I expressed the hope that we would soon be able to go back to the old way of doing things and hold live meetings here at the Mountain Club. Sadly, it was not to be. Another year of the COVID-19 pandemic has severely impacted the activities of the branch. In fact, last year's AGM, held almost exactly a year ago, was the last in-person meeting held by the branch until this evening, extraordinarily enough. For the whole of 2021, we have offered a fairly varied series of webinars. It was a completely online year, which has had the effect described later when I deal with membership. First off, on the 22nd of February, we were treated to another excellent address by Robert Jackson, the third in the series entitled Britain After Brexit. He spoke to us from his home in England, which worked very well. He brought us up to date on the effects of Brexit on the UK, and enthusiastic Brexiteer he is. He painted a very positive picture of developments from the British point of view. In April, we offered a double bill. On the 7th of April, Professor John Stremlau commented on the new Biden presidency in a very insightful address. And then at the end of April, we hosted Dr. Jan Erk from his office somewhere in Africa with a rather iffy connection, who analyzed the crisis in Ethiopia. As Dr. Erk said, most people know the headlines about this. Nobel Prize winner, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and his persecution of the Tigrayan region. But Dr. Erk laid out the history of Ethiopian politics, which brought the country to this juncture, and described the challenges of managing ethnic, religious, and linguistic diversity in that country. That is interesting from our point of view. For our first 3 webinars were well attended, with our audiences over 120. Thereafter, in June, some branch members participated in a webinar hosted by the Konrad Adenauer Foundation and SIRE Head Office on the crisis in northern Mozambique, and also jointly hosted by Konrad Adenauer Foundation and SIRE Head Office in July was a well-attended annual, but this time online, career event under the theme Careers in Transition, a post-pandemic green economy and implications for the world of work. The full details are given later in my report. With perfect timing, on the 5th of August, we hosted a webinar on the NATO-US withdrawal from the future of Afghanistan with our own Greg Mills and journalist John Mattison, who we have pleasure in welcoming here tonight. Thank you for attending, John. Both of them had fairly recently visited Afghanistan, and they were debating the issue. It was a fascinating discussion. Of course, the Taliban took over Kabul 10 days later. August was a busy month for us. On the 19th of August, we invited Dr. Jan Erk to pay us a return visit, this time speaking from Ghana, where he's currently the visiting professor at Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, on the role of Africa's traditional kingdoms today. As usual, it was an interesting address. On the 26th of August, our traditional schools quiz took place, again online, but with a difference. 92 learners from 25 schools competed as individuals, and a full report is included in my annual report below. But I would particularly like to thank Dr. Martha Bridgman, Martha, and our coordinator, Pippa Siegel, over there, for all their hard work in getting the quiz to function successfully under difficult circumstances. Many congratulations to the top winners who mostly attended an in-person awards ceremony at SIRE's Cape Town office to collect their prizes. Thanks to a donation by David Lynn of the Taipei Liaison Office in Cape Town, the 4 top winners received not only their cash prizes, but also a laptop computer. We thank them for this continued generous support, and the winners were clearly thrilled by this. Our last event for the year before this evening was an insightful webinar held on the 30th of September on the recent elections in Zambia, their regional impact and Zambia's priorities for reform, moderated by our EXCO member who's here tonight, Professor Roger Southall, 2 prominent Zambian academics, Nicole Beardsworth and Linda Kasondi, discussed the issues. The full record of our events is in my report. I just want to say a few words about membership. This time last year, we said COVID-19 may have an effect on membership. For the year under review, the absence of live events from March to June will have reduced the usual number of visitors joining. For the next period, July 2020 to June 2021, this effect may persist. Also, it remains to be seen how many members do not renew their membership as a result of limitations on live events. And so, alas, it came to pass. We lost about a third of our membership, including students, between the 1st of July and June 21, through non-renewal. Also, with no in-person, the attendance of a spread of 4 excellent webinar events was analysed. There was a total of attendees of 452, of whom 87 were members, in other words, 19%. It's obvious that most members do not like the webinar format. In July, EXCO decided to hold on to as much of the membership base as possible into 2022, and deeply discounted subscriptions were offered for a limited period, both as an incentive to renew, but also to compensate for the non-delivery of the type of events favoured by our members. The success or otherwise of the discounted subscriptions is difficult to gauge. However, there's a baseline table in my report which illustrates the impact of COVID-19 on the branch to date. Fortunately, we have donor members, and this category was revived last year as a result of generous donations to the branch's sustainability fund. Yes, in the current year, there are 9 donor members who donated a total of 2,720 Rand, for which we thank them. The standard membership table is in my report. Just turning briefly to the various portfolios handled by EXCO members, this has been a second pandemic impacted year, resulting in very little activity in liaising with Parliament, the universities, the Cape Chamber, and the diplomatic corps. Unfortunately, a projected address by the new Moroccan ambassador had to be cancelled when the ambassador fell ill. We are fortunate to have EXCO member Richard Morris handle the branch's finances, and his report will follow this one. I just want to thank him and Pippa Siegel, our administrator, and our honorary treasurer, for Richard Morris, and our honorary auditor, Johan Hauser, who's been doing duty at the door this evening. Thank you very much for maintaining and authenticating the branch financial records and accounts. Yeah, they will Richard will give the financial report after I've completed my report as a separate report to this meeting. Just want to mention one or two things about the quiz. I've been given ample details of this by Martha, and it is in the whole detail, all the details in the report. But as I said, we had individual learners, 92 of them from 25 schools, and it was hosted online for the second time. African Milani of Cape Talk Radio again served as master of ceremonies, opening the quiz in Zoom, and then handing over to Pippa Seagull, who ran it. The quiz is important to us. It's part of our international affairs ongoing program to cultivate awareness among younger citizens of the importance of South Africa's foreign affairs. And I just didn't mention the prizes, only the computers, but the person who got first prize got 4,500 Rand. That was Greg van Selm of SACS, and congratulations to him for winning first prize. Second prize was 2,000 Rand and the tablet. That was Kate Forrest from Herschel, who came a close second. And then the third prize was 1,500 Rand and the tablet. That was won by Pollyanna Carlos from Weinberg Girls High. And SACS learner won the fourth prize, 1,250 Rand. That was plus his tablet, and that was Mutadir Furfree of SACS. Well done to all of them who participated. The other annual event that we host is, as I said, the careers evening, and that was hosted online by Konrad Adenauer Foundation and SIRE head office. The event was well attended with 180 live attendees, and that was, one can really say, a success. The CAS SIRE Scholars of 2021, Stephanie Meek, Maneli Nene, and Jaco Wolf, and Julia Rupier, and Kanyisa Similani. We'd like to extend our sincere gratitude to both CAS, Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and SIRE head office, as well as Pippa, our coordinator, for the support in planning and hosting this event. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, it's been a very difficult year, and I want to compliment and thank the members of our EXCO for all their efforts in keeping the show on the road. Our new EXCO members, Roger Southall and Anne Thompson, have played their part and have been a great addition to our EXCO, as have the three new university representatives, Jaco Wolf, Maneli Nene, and Stephanie Meek. Our Deputy Chair, Martin Traynor, who sadly couldn't be with us today as he has family issues, has been a rock in difficult times, and he does a huge amount of work in the background on membership and all sorts of administrative issues. Thanks again to Richard Morris for all his hard work on our finances in these difficult times, difficult economic times, I should say, ably assisted as by our auditor, Johan Hauser. Jeremy Wiley keeps up our connection with the Cape Chamber, which we thank him, and he keeps us in touch with economic issues as well. And SIRE National Council member Mike Spicer does valuable work on our EXCO. I would like to thank Dr. Martha Bridgman and our coordinator, Pippa Siebel, for their huge efforts in holding a very successful schools quiz, and a big thank you to Pippa for always being there for us and running an efficient administration. Last but not least, I have to mention with regret that two long-serving EXCO members, Rob Mackay and Chris Saunders, are calling it a day. Rob has been on EXCO for so long, he's almost part of the furniture. He looks after diplomatic liaison, but he's always ready to step in to help, from taking minutes to chairing meetings. He and his wife will now spend much more time abroad with their children. Thank you, Rob, for your great contribution. And Chris Saunders has held our university portfolio for many years and has been a wonderful resource. We never settle on the title of an address without getting Chris's advice. We will greatly miss his wisdom and insight. Thank you for your years of support of the branch. And ladies and gentlemen, that concludes my report. Thank you. I'd like to hand over to Richard, and I'm going to shift this so that you can be seen.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Got it.
Yep. That's good. Right. Can you hear this or not? Can. The activities, as you will have understood, were very limited during the financial year to 30th of June 2021. And there are copies of the financial statements which were on the table, and I trust you've got those in front of you. So I'm not going to go through this in high detail, but the bottom line is that the result, the overall result for the year, was a tiny surplus of 1,054 Rand. And where did that come from? On the administrative side, we had a small loss of 3,800. And on the events side, we had a small surplus of 4,000 Rand. But that really represented some investment income, which we received as a result of money in our strategic income fund. These are monies which were surplus to immediate requirements for the quiz. And those were invested there in order to get a better return than we could get on the Standard Bank market-linked account. So with those, you will see that on the administration side, we've got the membership subscriptions, which had fallen dramatically from 47,000 in the previous year to 25,000. Now, part of the reason for that big drop was the fact that we got an additional membership from schools participating in the quiz in the 2020 financial year, which didn't happen in the 2021 year. So there was 12,000 that fell away. And that's the reason for the very big drop. On top of that, there was a further reduction because of people not renewing their subscriptions. The next line is the support that we received from the head office in Johannesburg of 16,000, and the branch is really completely dependent for its sort of financial survival on that support from head office of 16,000. Then the next item is that we had a small amount of bank charges, which are unavoidable. And then there's the honorarium, which is paid to our administrator, Pippa, which remained in line with what it was in the prior year at 42,000. So that led to that result of a small surplus of 1,000. On the balance sheet side, we've got a branch operating surplus, which finished the year at 38,000, having started the year at 37,000. And we also have obviously the ring-fenced funds that are to do with the quiz, which is the amount of 155,000, which compares with the prior year of 181,000. Now, the quiz monies are at this high level at this stage because the quiz event hasn't happened. That only happens in August. And then obviously a lot of that money is spent. So the figure that you see here drops significantly after the 30th of June. And that equivalent figure, if we look at it at today, is sitting at of the order of 101,000. So that gives you a gauge of what was spent on the quiz post 30th of June 2021. I think the asset side of the balance sheet is quite straightforward. You see that the 105,000 that's in the Coronation Strategic Income Fund, that's remained unchanged from the prior year. And then if you look at we've got a Standard Bank money market account and a current account of 85,000 and 6,000 respectively, and a small amount of petty cash. That's the asset side of the balance sheet. If there are any questions, I'm happy to try and answer those. Otherwise, May I have are there any questions about the financial statements? Yes.
Together.
Yeah. So, yes, the outlook for the ensuing financial year to 2022 is also somber because of the decline in membership dues being received and subscriptions. So the position of the branch is not strong. Happily, as Sheila mentioned earlier, some people have voluntarily put in another 2,700 over and above what was requested in subscriptions. So that's positive. And previously we had donations of 5,000. So we've got a total of 7,700 in this sustainability fund. The idea was that this would be built up to a level where the branch would perhaps in the future not be dependent on head office and would be viable in its own right. But we've got a long journey to travel there. So having said that, are there any questions?
Okay. Marvelous. Then can I just...
Yes. Back to you, Sheila.
I've got it round my ear.
You've got it, yes. Okay.
Anyway, right. Well, if there are no questions, we could proceed to, I can ask you to perhaps propose the adoption of the annual report and the financial report. We are quorate, and in fact, we've got 5 more people present than we did last year at the AGM, which is quite something, and 2 online. So we're 29 plus 2. So could I have somebody propose the adoption and second? So Martha Bridgman and Mike Spicer. Thank you very much. Seconding. So that's now we'll go to general. Has anybody got anything to raise under general? Anyone? No? Well, if that's the case, then I'm going to close the AGM and we can then perhaps, sorry, please.
Can I say something in general?
Please do.
I wanted to say a huge thank you to Sheila. This has been a very difficult year for you, Sheila. I would acknowledge that I think you only during this year. And yet you carried on, and I appreciate that.
Thank you.
I'm glad that we have been able to support you, but I do appreciate that you have led the branch. So I wanted to just thank you for your service to SILA.
Thank you so much, Martha. Very kind of you. Now, at this point, would everybody like to have refill their glasses? Can we have a 5-minute break? Because I do see that Professor Butler is here and he's ready to start, but perhaps we could just give everybody a chance to have another samosa sorry, I do apologize for that. I just wanted to advise the meeting that we've had proposals for nominations, for the existing committee, executive committee, and we haven't got any new proposals or nominations. And apart from the 2 members who I mentioned who have resigned, I propose we just carry on, or can somebody propose we carry on? Because the different positions will be sorted out at the first EXCO meeting after the AGM. So we have the nomination talks. Yes. Thank you very much, John. Can somebody second that? Everybody saying it's unanimous. Good. Would you recall that? Thank you. Right. Well, having done that, could we have a break now?
Yes.
So we have a short break to recharge your glasses and get a samosa. Thank you very much for attending. Welcome back. No, it's not working.
I'm aiming for 30 minutes. So
That's perfect. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We're restarting the meeting, and we're very honoured to have Professor Anthony Butler here. He's going to talk about, well, his topic is entitled, Will Cyril Ramaphosa's second term have a more domestic or a more international orientation? Now, Professor Butler is the Professor of Political Studies at UCT. He was educated at St. Anne's College, Oxford, and King's College, Cambridge. He's been a Fellow of Emmanuel College, Cambridge, Director of the Politics and Administration Programme at Birkbeck College, University of London, and he was Chair in Political Studies at Wits. He's also made particular contributions to the study of South African politics with a focus on the internal politics of the ANC, party modernization and political funding. He's the author of a number of books, including the biography of Cyril Ramaphosa, and he's a regular columnist for Johannesburg's Business Day newspaper. Over to Professor Butler. Thank you.
thank you very much. Is that the on button? Thank you very much, Sheila. And thank you to the SIRE Executive Western Cape for inviting me to speak. I'd like to begin with two cautions. The first one is that I was surprised to have been invited to speak to SIRE, in part because I know almost nothing about international relations, foreign policy, or the international politics of the African continent, which are the areas in which I believe SIRE specializes. And I suspected that I would most usefully be able to focus on President Cyril Ramaphosa, who I have studied over quite a long period of time. And I thought I would take this as an opportunity to think about whether and how we could view Ramaphosa as a foreign policy president or not. My second caution flows from the past week that I've spent marking first year politics exams. And one thing that I've noticed about this task is how students respond when they have no idea what the answer to the set question is. And I realized quite early on, after some head scratching, that I had no idea what the answer was to the question that I asked, even though I asked it myself. And so I'm going to adopt two of the strategies that my first year students use. One of them is to talk at some length about a tangentially related set of issues that might have some bearing on the question. And the second one is I'm going to run out of time and rush through the last few minutes of my talk to give you the impression that I do in fact have an answer to the set question, but I don't have an opportunity to deliver it to you. So with those two cautions, I'm going to talk under two broad sections. And the first one is I'm going to try and set out a loose framework for trying to understand the role of presidential leadership in foreign policy in post-apartheid South Africa, insofar as I can discern one. And the second section, I will try to look at Ramaphosa himself to see if there's anything that that we can discern about his life and career that might tell us what he might do should he decide to become a more activist and innovative foreign policy president in his second term. So first of all, trying to think about the question of political leadership
in foreign policy, I think many of us, including me, are influenced by presidential systems of government, in part because we have somebody who's called a president. We imagine that much of the foreign policy literature about presidential leadership might apply to us. In particular, in presidential systems, the president is directly elected, enjoys a personal mandate, and inhabits a political system with a clearly defined separation of powers. And one of the consequences of that separation of powers, in combination with a personal mandate, is that many presidents in presidential systems drift away from the tightly constrained environment of domestic politics into the arena of international affairs, where they're much less constrained. And this is a classic argument, particularly I was thinking here of Richard Neustadt's book, Presidential Power, from half a century ago, arguing that American presidents are least constrained and most dangerous when it comes to international affairs, where the actions that they take are potentially irreversible and most damaging. Now, South Africa is not a presidential system. South Africa has a parliamentary system of government, albeit one in which the head of the executive is also the head of state. And one thing that flows from that is that the president is dependent upon the confidence and consent of his party in a way that a president, a directly elected president, isn't. And one of the constant themes of foreign policy post-apartheid is the episodic and sometimes confusing intervention of the party in foreign policy positions adopted by the state. And we've seen, of course, that twice, it's become a pattern, twice we've seen two-term presidents removed in 2008 and 2018 by their own parties, demonstrating for us that this is a parliamentary system in which the parties, however incoherent their policy positions may be, are ultimately in charge of the fate of their leaders. This has another implication, which is that the governing party's conception of foreign policy is important in shaping how South Africa interacts with other countries. And two aspects of that I think are particularly important. One of them is a preference for party-to-party relationships. So formal relationships between governments are not the way of doing business that find most favor in the ANC. Party-to-party relationships, including with parties such as the Communist Party of China, United Party in Russia, are often seen as preferred vehicles for striking deals that are significant for how South Africa conducts its foreign affairs. There have also been other ANC legacies that have been important in shaping how South Africa has approached international affairs, and one of those is obviously a strong anti-imperialist sentiment in ANC politics, a strong commitment to social justice, a series of historical relationships that derive from the period of struggle against apartheid. And sometimes this results in an unwillingness to begin from clear appraisal of where South Africa's economic and political interests lie. I'll come back to that later. Now, within the state, we also have, as part of the system of government in South Africa, we have a cabinet system that quite strongly, excuse me, I'm not sure if it's me or the mic, you're getting a slight hissing, strongly constrains the ability of a president to exercise initiative in foreign policy. So a cabinet system is designed to distribute authority between members of the cabinet. The president obviously appoints members of the cabinet, but authority is distributed between members of cabinet, and we have powerful role players in formerly Foreign Affairs, DIRCO, in the Department of Trade and Industry, in Department of Defense. And the perennial failure of South African governments to bring about coordination between different departments within the cabinet system applies in foreign policy as much as in domestic policy. The South African system of government is, I think, unique in that we have not just coordinating departments, but we also have a cabinet cluster that coordinates the coordinating departments. So it's called the governance cluster. And foreign affairs is not exempt from the problems that bedevil cabinet policy making within the country. Now, the Constitution views the president as the custodian of foreign policy, but it also mandates the Minister of Foreign Affairs to formulate and execute foreign policy. And one consequence of this is that as presidents become increasingly preoccupied with particular foreign policy priorities, they are disincentivized to appoint effective, capable ministers of foreign affairs. And I think that's something that we saw both under Mbeki, who was a very activist foreign policy president, and under Zuma for somewhat different reasons. We also in South Africa have very powerful non-state actors who constrain the ability of a president to initiate new directions in foreign policy, including parastatals and big businesses. So we have powerful private businesses in the resources sector and the financial sector that have in effect been able to purchase political influence, in part because of the nature of black economic empowerment policy in South Africa. Now, despite all of these constraints, and something I haven't discussed, which is the long-term and structural character of constraints that surround foreign policy in any country, despite this, there have been opportunities for presidents to exert agency, to exert influence over South Africa's relations with important foreign powers. And these have partly flowed from a history of division within the society, a division about what the ultimate purposes of foreign policy should be, and a history of division between, I suppose, an acceptance of the institutional legacies both of international capitalism, Western dominance of the international system, and a commitment to liberation movement partners and issues of social injustice. Nelson Mandela was perhaps least successful in that he or those around him elaborated a policy based around, a foreign policy based ostensibly around values that famously and quickly ran into the ground, but created something of an albatross, I think, an expectation that South Africa's foreign policy should be judged in accordance with a series of moral imperatives that other countries were not expected to comply with. Thabo Mbeki equally famously pursued a necessary corrective in an African-centered foreign policy. But even he, I think, tired of his own conception of African Renaissance and was moving in his second term towards a much broader vision of South-South cooperation that included the initial stages of cooperation with other large, complex democracies in the South, such as India and Brazil, and also some of the first steps that culminated in the BRICS project. Now, Zuma, of course, managed to create room for maneuver for himself as well, which he used for rather different purposes. But the context of Zuma's foreign policy was one of straitened circumstances. So the ambitions of the Mbeki period were not, could not be financed. And after the global economic crisis, Zuma's foreign policy was one that was much more, by necessity, focused on South Africa's domestic economic interests. So more of a focus on economic diplomacy, less of a focus on the kinds of interventions that Thabo Mbeki saw as a part of creating a role for South Africa on the continent. Now, my view on BRICS, I said at the outset that I know very little about international relations. And my view on BRICS was always that it had multiple motivations behind it. The immediate propellant that brought South Africa into the BRICS orbit may well have been a more practical issue of nuclear procurement. So BRICS was clearly centered around China. You could understand that South Africa might wish to participate in an international grouping that sometimes call it crabs, resource-producing countries, like Australia, Canada, Brazil, Russia, South Africa. The logic of BRICS was all about China, but it was also about China and Russia's imperative to export and to utilize their capacity to build nuclear generation capacity in other countries. And I always recall that it was in the dying days of the Mbeki presidency that ESCOM did not sign its deal with Ariva and EDF to buy nuclear power stations from France. And the expectation was that we would enjoy a new relationship with France and China, joined on nuclear power cooperation. But many of us missed the significance of Russia. Nuclear power is a magnet for corruption in part for the same reasons as arms procurement, in that you have enormous sums of money involved. I think we were talking very, very large sums. Terry will know the numbers. 1 trillion rand. I like that number. I'm also a bit suspicious when the number turns out to be exactly 1 trillion. But a small proportion of 1 trillion is quite a lot. And like arms procurement, nuclear power deals are easily shrouded in a cloak of national security. They are inherently opaque because they're technical, scientific. And of course, the Russians had a problem, and as of course the French, they had a problem of capacity and a desire within their own societies to move away from this means of power generation. Now, in August 2014, President Zuma traveled to Moscow, and if you recall, on his own. One of my favorite episodes of Zuma's life. Some people suggested he was on holiday, and when I looked it up, it transpired that he stayed at the President Hotel in Moscow in the presidential suite. So it's in the heart of Moscow. It allowed him to take a break, to stroll through the Alexander Gardens, to visit Lenin's mausoleum. And the hotel is run by the Department of Foreign Affairs. The Department of Foreign Affairs of the President himself. From back in the Soviet era. And the presidential suite, according to the advertising for the hotel, has a safe large enough to accommodate significant numbers of suitcases. I don't buy suitcases, even in Gladstone on my Mr. Fit. I didn't try to put my suitcase in the safe. But even more potentially important is that the presidential suite has 2 bathrooms, one of which is equipped with a jacuzzi. And one of my Russian colleagues at a conference that I attended at the Institute for African Studies in Moscow in 2015, he remarked that it's a complex problem keeping hidden cameras working when the lens steams up in an environment such as a jacuzzi. I wasn't sure what the that was not the worst of Zuma. Perhaps the worst of Zuma from South Africa's relationships in Africa concerned the abuse of South Africa's power to lobby for positions in the African Union when Jacob Zuma determined that Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma should become chair of the African Union in a clear breach of convention that, for obvious reasons, suggested that small countries without power and money should hold that position. And if you recall, it was a very lengthy process of shoehorning Dlamini-Zuma into that position, which did enormous damage. And I think he still has left legacies of mistrust on the continent. Now, at the time, my colleagues in the Department of Politics at UCT, who I depend on for judgments and information about African affairs, they told me this was evidently to do with domestic politics. And I could see the logic in that this was about Dlamini-Zuma being positioned so that she could acquire seniority and return from the African Union just in time for the 2017 conference of the ANC. So this is Jacob Zuma playing a reasonably long game. 5 years is quite a long time in politics. And I was assured by a senior NEC member that when Zuma first told her that she was going to be deployed to the African Union, that she broke down into tears. She didn't want to go. But by 2012, when she understood the game plan, she'd come around to it. Now there you see an egregious instance of an abuse of an African institution that's been to some extent painstakingly constructed over a long period of time. It's fragile, being abused for domestic political purposes. Okay. I'm going to move on to section 2, Sheila, which is where I'm going to talk about Ramaphosa very briefly. Because I know I'm talking for slightly too long.
No, it's fine. Please carry on.
Okay. All right, so one of my thoughts here is that presidents in South Africa and our parliamentary system are quite constrained by their parties, by their institutions, by the fundamental economic interests of the country. And in fact, increasingly over time, those longer-term structural factors have become more important and constrain presidents. Where our presidents have decided, worked out ways of exercising agency, it's largely been benign. So they have pursued personal agendas. And this is particularly the case with Jacob Zuma. Now, Ramaphosa is in many respects a more positive prospect in that he's an institution builder. So far, he's adopted a low profile in foreign affairs. I think that's fair to say, perhaps in part because he's been rather unlucky in that he's become president after a decade of Jacob Zuma, after 2.5 decades of ANC government, but also because, of course, of the COVID crisis. Ramaphosa seemed to be set in February 2020, as COVID was about to be launched. He became chair of the AU for a year. He became chair of the African peer review mechanism. South Africa was still at that point in the second year of its membership of the Security Council. COVID, more or less, I would say, put a stop to any initiatives he might have had. But in retrospect, the hopes for Ramaphosa in foreign policy are perhaps similar to the hopes for Ramaphosa in domestic policy. So the African peer review mechanism, as I understand it, South Africa has been evading, sidestepping the African peer review mechanism itself. And certainly its credibility as a champion of accountability in African government has come under question. But Ramaphosa also focused on the implementation in his remarks in early 2020, the implementation of the African free trade, African Continental Free Trade Agreement. There again, as an outsider to international relations, it doesn't strike me that that agreement has very much to offer to South Africa, an economy dominated by services, in which very little progress has been made towards defining what a free trade in services might look like across the continent. In addition, the problems closer to home in the region have really not been addressed. And Ramaphosa has shown no I think it's fair to say he's shown no fresh approaches to making SADC more of an effective building block. For a more open trading and investment regime on the continent. Now, there was one interesting view of Ramaphosa's first 2 or 3 years as president, expressed by Fritz Nganje, Odilili Ayodele, in the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of International Studies earlier this year. And they described Ramaphosa in this way. He cut his teeth at international affairs from the perspective of a corporate titan rather than that of a statesman. It is no wonder during his presidency that there has been an intensified shift towards economic diplomacy. Now, I think that there's some truth in this, that Ramaphosa is more alert to the interests of businesses, how they operate on the continent, than his predecessors. But I also think that Ramaphosa is a more complex character than this description suggests. And I think firstly we should qualify the notion that he is a business titan and recognize that his business activities were overwhelmingly domestic. And in the empowerment regime that South Africa has used as a way of building a black business class, the incentives are not towards entrepreneurship. And Ramaphosa, through his Shanduka vehicle, has quite effectively accumulated wealth without engaging in significant cross-continental, cross-national business transactions or initiatives. Ramaphosa also has a real history of relationships with people in quite different parts of the world. And I was struck, I was trying to think about his childhood. He grew up in Johannesburg. He was an enthusiast for America. And we often forget that Johannesburg is a self-consciously modern city, or was. 1960s and 1970s, Ramaphosa was an enthusiast for the Kennedys. He watched movies all the time, Hollywood movies. He was, rather embarrassingly, he once suggested that he became a trade union leader inspired by Sylvester Stallone. And Sylvester Stallone portrayed a trade union leader in a film called Fist, F-I-S-T, Norman Jewison film about the truckers union in the US. Teamsters, exactly, yeah. And yes, a very embarrassing interview, which I'm happy to share. So he was influenced very much by, how can we describe it, Western modernism. But at the same time, a lot of his politics, as he went through his career, was increasingly preoccupied with social injustice. And he was very close to people in international communist organizations. And these were his friends. So he had friends in many places, and he appeared to be able to live with close personal relationships with people who were very ideologically motivated in different ways. And one example of that is, for example, the Mennels, who inadvertently almost became his adopters and sponsors in the 1970s when he was released from detention and through a series of relationships, an Amnesty International sponsor of Ramaphosa who had funded some of his legal fees, happened to know the Mennel family. Ramaphosa, through that avenue, became involved in the Urban Foundation and came to know many important liberal business people and political figures in South Africa at that time. Through his trade union career, he ended up interacting with figures as different as Arthur Scargill, so the head of the British National Union of Mine Workers was a communist. One of Cyril's close friends was Vic Allen, who wrote a book on the National Mine Workers Union. They met on a boat off the coast of Cuba, waiting to meet Fidel Castro. And Cyril had close friendships. His closest political allies in the 1980s and early 1990s were also ostensibly communists. But the thing about Ramaphosa is that he was always able to play both sides of the political fence. So the National Union of Mine Workers received funding on a large scale from union federations aligned with Moscow, from Scandinavians, European and American aligned union federations. They had an ability to persuade people that he was a person who they should support. And he managed to keep his constituencies apart from one another. When I wrote my biography of Ramaphosa in 2007, one of his closest political allies in the National Union of Mine Workers and in the South African Communist Party said to me, we never knew that Ramaphosa was involved in the Urban Foundation, that he might socially have known business people like the Mennels or Bobby Godson, that despite all that they'd been through, Ramaphosa managed to compartmentalize his life and his relationships. And I think, I am going to draw to a close, don't worry. And I think you look at the range of relationships that Ramaphosa has, his personal networks, both on the side of labor, on the left, and in business, they're incredibly wide. Much of it from his period of exclusion from central participation in ANC politics. He looks to me like candy floss in a way. And it's epitomized by his participation in the Coca-Cola advisory board. But there are many other such things that Cyril did. Unilever advisory board, Commonwealth Business Council. So these are all activities that involve traveling around and meeting the great and the good, usually politicians who are past their sell-by date. So he did a lot of this. He had an enormous network of contacts. He participated in the Northern Ireland peace process and earned the trust of people in that very complex situation. He was a participant in the United Nations, the Commission on Intervention of State Sovereignty. Now, all of these activities, I think, are essentially meaningless from the perspective of his ability now to contribute to South Africa's foreign policy. So he knows people like and trust him. He has the ability to communicate with people from quite extraordinarily different backgrounds, with different philosophies of life, with different interests. But what does it mean when it comes to advancing the interests of South Africa as South Africa is today? I think to some extent it's the same problem that he faces in domestic affairs, that he is a conciliator who is very effective at bringing together people who disagree. And perhaps in a society like South Africa, that's still very important in domestic affairs. But when it comes to foreign affairs, there isn't a social compact. There isn't a social compact that can bring Ramaphosa's friends like Richard Holbrooke, Eva Morales, Fidel Castro, that can bring them together. And in a sense, the approach that Ramaphosa has and the wide networks that he enjoys might even be an obstacle to trying to define a clear foreign policy for South Africa, and for trying to define a collective understanding of what the national interest is that South Africa should be attempting to pursue. Let me leave it there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Get this thing to work. It doesn't work.
Let me give you another one.
Well, I just talk.
I'm very worried. I'm intimidated by this Zoom process that's going on.
I know, it's
There are
okay.
people watching me, and I feel like I can't drink my.
Well, I think at question time you can. How's that?
Oh,
Yeah. Good. Cheers to that. Well, thank you very much for a very interesting talk, and you know, describing the differences between the different. I don't think this is working. Is it working? The difference. That's fine. The difference in approach between the different presidents, and also the particular policy approach of Cyril. Really very helpful detail you've given us, I think, tonight. And I'm sure people have questions. So could I ask anybody with a question put up their hand? I see John Mattison hand, and I see Dr. Sarah Pinard. So let's start with them. John? Oh, sorry, Sarah. Go ahead.
I'm reminded again of Targo Min's session about the African Renaissance and about an enormous expensive building was put up. These people halfway houses now have somewhere between houses.
Midbar.
Yeah. The African Parliament.
Midran.
Parliament was going to Pan-African Parliament. And I remember at the time that I was living up there, you know, what a very rapid and expensive building this was, what an incredible role it was going to play in leadership and in bringing Africa to its scale. As far as I know, it's been a complete flop. It's an expensive and empty, probably now deteriorating building somewhere there in one law. I think so everyone and apart from this or anything about it. Simply just a quick thought on this, which I have been following in my sort of amateurish child way, certainly since before South Africa joined 2012. But it seems that what I'm seeing since then is that the main effect on South Africa being a member of it has been to make it absolutely obedient to Russia and China in the larger international forum. And leaving economics aside, I have to look at their voting patterns. Whenever South Africa has a non-permanent member on the Security Council, which is quite often, they never ever raise a voice against anything that Russia or China are doing. And I think that certainly, however sort of obvious economic side and certainly atomic energy, that the main purpose was to start building a bloc which was anti-Western. And to have South Africa in it, in my view, is very counterproductive to what the country's interests are. But I think that's where they are, and some reason where they're comfortable to be. They've never voted once, even when the abuses of human rights in those countries have been quite painful, and everybody else has voted. They haven't. They're either abstained or voted against. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Would you like to have the other question as well? Or will you answer Sarah now?
I'm sure that's quite a lot for me.
Okay. Right. Anthony?
I'm not sure I know the answers, but the Pan-African Parliament is still functioning, but not very successfully, I think.
Every now and then.
Yeah. And I think it's difficult to build institutions of that kind, and that doesn't mean that they are not potentially valuable. I think many of those initiatives, they derive from the Mbeki period. Mbeki he turned out to be an institution builder in African politics. And I think that was actually rather important, because Africa has found it difficult to assert the interests of the inhabitants of the continent in the face of the continued power exercised by former colonial powers and also new powers that are interested in exploiting South Africa's resources and Africa's resources, such as China. So I agree with you, Pan-African Parliament has not been a success, but I don't agree that it's not something that should be pursued. In BRICS, I've offered you my skeptical interpretation of why South Africa, one of the reasons why South Africa might have become a participant. I don't understand the logic of BRICS, to be quite honest. It's a Chinese dominated federation, and China no longer seems particularly interested in perpetuating it. And I do think that Russia, from what I can see, I think international relations specialists probably need to ask this question, but I certainly don't think that South Africa has been slavishly pursuing an anti-Western line of the United Nations, or following slavishly the positions of the Russian Federation. So Russia is the permanent member that is overwhelmingly permanent member that votes against proposals that emanate from Western countries. And on occasion, South Africa abstains quite often, I think, rather than overtly supporting Russia. And so I don't think Russia is a big player in our international politics. Now that Zuma's gone, yes, exactly. Yes, exactly. It's not in our interests to be an ally of Russia, which is, and I often joke that we share quite a lot. It's a a resource country that's undergone massive deindustrialization and is resorting to the vilification of Western powers and attempted surveillance state to keep control. So there are those parallels between Russia and elements in Zuma's ANC, but I don't think that there are underlying interests, common interests between Russia and South Africa.
Thank you. John Matheson?
Thanks. Do I need the mic?
Your voice can be heard.
Okay.
I don't know, the mics aren't seem to collapse.
Okay.
We don't have our usual technical team here,
If you
unfortunately.
don't mind me sitting, I have a couple of comments and sort of leading into a couple of questions. I mean, I found your talk helpful and insightful, and I largely agree with it. I just wanted to raise a couple of bits and pieces. One is, I mean, what you're talking about for foreign policy, his foreign policy seems to be somewhat similar to his domestic policy, which is a sort of a lack of policy. and that links, you were saying he's not a president in the sense, Biden is president, but it raises questions about our cabinet responsibility, because there seems no consistency between what one cabinet minister says versus what another. And to what degree is that really the system? And to what degree is that really so? I know when I was on the SABC board, the worst thing you could ever suggest was that we talk to the finance minister because we fell under communications minister. And that was and these silos are rigid. And I think that predates it all, but I'm not sure that it has to be like that under our system. Just one thing he did do on foreign policy, I mean, two things. The one is on vaccinations and on negotiating the 130 billion on green energy. I mean, that's of course where he's at his strength, because he can talk to people, bring people together around something. But I agree with you on bilateral things. He seems to be a bit at sea. And then finally, I just want to ask specifically, you referred to the party-to-party relationships with United Russia and the Communist Party of China. And I wonder if you could flesh out any specifics on those two. What do those party-to-party talks achieve? Is there any specific you can point to?
Thanks, John. Anthony?
Yes. No, I think on the first point about the way in which government functions, it does predate Ramaphosa. I'm not entirely sure where the problem lies, whether it's an institutional problem or something about the political culture. And I see many parallels with the cabinet system in European countries and in the UK, where the relationship between the people who control the public expenditure and the people who control spending departments is a contested one, and one in which the Treasury in this case is always in the firing line. And I can see reasons why you would try to insulate the Treasury from direct approaches from interest groups and from departments. So in South Africa, the allocation of resources is mediated through the cabinet process as well as by Treasury itself.
Sorry, if I could just come in. Of course, you're right about the Treasury part of it, but Montash and Pravin Gordhan were at loggerheads as well over, and there are various different ministers that aren't Treasury.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's right. And I think there are areas, and they're multiplying, in which different government departments have to work together. And we've always had a problem. I talked earlier about the coordinating departments being coordinated. When we look at the most intractable problems in the energy sector, we have always had incredibly cumbersome machinery. So we have a Department of Energy, which is now Department of Minerals and Energy, as a policy-making department. And we have Department of Public Enterprises as the stakeholder representative. We have the presidency involved. We have a regulator that's never functioned very well. And we have a parastatal that has its own political power. So we have a very complex environment for taking decisions about cross-cutting issues. And some of the newer challenges that we're facing are inherently cross-cutting. And these involve, for example, climate change. And it's not a surprise that there are conflicts between different departments around the response to climate change.
But they're not resolved.
They're not resolved, exactly. Yeah.
There seems to be no cabinet responsibility. I'm sorry.
No,
Chair.
No, I mean, I think that's right. They're not resolved, and to some extent it's because they're not resolvable. And I'm sympathetic to what you're saying. But in a sense, the transition that's required in energy is beyond the capabilities of the state and of the political system to accomplish. So the conflicts that we're seeing between ministers are expressions of an inability to resolve those conflicts, in part because of a lack of resources. But they're also, I think, partly negotiating issues and symbolic. So it's important for Ramaphosa to show that he has the interests of people who are going to be impacted by the energy transition in mind, partly because there's such important constituencies in the Mine Workers Union, South African Communist Party, and so on. But also because there's genuine suffering that is going to result from the energy transition. And we can see the same issues coming towards us in areas like in broader decarbonisation issues. And when we look at our automobile sector, so we have, despite what SIRE papers are always telling me, South Africa's largest trading partner is the Eurozone, not China. And with the Eurozone, we do important trade in complex goods, including in the automobile sector. And the transition to electric vehicles is not just going to leave us behind as an economy, it's going to leave behind one of our most important and sophisticated economic sectors if the different actors involved in that sector can't be brought together in a hurry. And the difficulty is that we don't have the capacity in our system of government, in part because of the government machinery itself, but also because of the intractability of the problems. And they have a long history because this is it's a carbon economy.
and the party-to-party contact.
And the party-to-party. My field is not international relations, as I said, but public administration, which is more racy and exciting. And one thing that I do is I attend webinars of the National School of Government. And one thing that I've learned, I participated in one yesterday. One thing I've learned is that our DGs, when they go through their courses at the National School of Government, which apparently our DGs require, members of the Communist Party of China are sitting in on those webinars as training sessions. I think this is an exciting development in many ways, and I don't know how seriously to view it, but there is an admiration for how the Chinese Communist Party has achieved extraordinary development accomplishments over the past 2 decades. And I would say it's more than simply a desire for a form of modernization that isn't westernization. It's in part that to see a society that has modernized, industrialized, and become powerful is not Western. It's tremendously appealing. But there are also people in the ANC that, like William and Tache, who are more ideological, who believe that lessons can be learned from how the Chinese Communist Party has reinvented itself. I think there's something there that's more than, I think the old relationships with the Soviet Union, Zuma style, are dead. But there's something live there with the Chinese Communist Party, that there are real hopes and expectations within some parts of the ANC about what that relationship might mean.
Thanks a lot, Anthony. I see Jeremy Wiley's got his hand up, and Dr. Craven for that.
Thank you. Jeremy Wiley.
Three more
I'm just a
questions.
simple.
Is there anybody on this side? And Malcolm, okay, I've got 4 left. Right.
No, I'm a simple businessman. I'm sorry I haven't read your book, your autobiography.
No, nobody's read it. In fact, my wife had it on the bedside table for about a year with the page mark on about page 25. And then one day she suddenly said, I finished it. And then she put it away. And so then.
But not having read your book, but having followed Mr. Ramaphosa's career through South Africa over the last 3.5 decades, one has seen a man who has made a significant contribution to the debate and resolving the South African conundrum, or many conundrums. However, it's been a very parochial kind of involvement, and you touched on that earlier. But in his role, in his current role, and leading up to his current role, there have been numerous occasions when he has not used his intellect and his experience to actually influence South African foreign policy. One of the classic cases is Zimbabwe. He was in the thick of things through the development of the ANC to this point. And he ignored, to a large extent, Zimbabwe. And we are sitting with the results of that ignorance and that neglect of our neighbor next door. It's had a huge socio-economic impact on South Africa over many years. We look at, during the Zuma years, the BRICS, he was at Zuma's right-hand man, but he played no role in, I believe, in, for instance, making the new bank, the new financial institution come alive. One doesn't see that at all. And he could have done that coming with his business experience. The third area was, for instance, 2013 in the Central African Republic. South Africa was betrayed by its president. And the defense force was abused to support local parochial ANC business interests. Ramaphosa didn't say a word. It worries me that the president of the country right now has not got a track record of being decisive, and he's not shown that he understands the role that he's going to play as the leader of the country in the international arena.
Thanks, Jeremy. Do you want to answer that one? We'll go one by one.
Or we could do all the
Well,
last
let's get the
ones.
last four. If you, is that all right?
I can probably manage, yeah.
Okay. Thanks. And then it was the gentleman there. If you could just mention your name.
I'm John Rhodes, University of Oxford. I wanted to pick up on the issues around policy and coherence and the failure to build a state in foreign. You gave a very persuasive analysis of why Ramaphosa goes along with the ideological necrophilia of the alliance and members of his own cabinet. But if one looks at his desperation for foreign direct investment from the United States, from Europe, and look then at South African representation, he has done nothing to rebuild the intellectual capacity of Durban, which was destroyed. He hasn't built an intellectual capacity in the union buildings in a way which they certainly would. And he has allowed South African representation to be a global embarrassment. And that's especially so in the United States, where whatever people may feel about Ibrahim Rasool, he was a remarkably successful ambassador. Won the prize from the Washington Press Club for his success. Now, it is an intellectual embarrassment to look at how South Africa is represented. The New York issue, the Chicago conflict shut down. So where is Ramaphosa in the capable state when it comes to foreign affairs?
Thank you very much. Patrick, to that.
Comment. Thank you very much for confirming Arthur Starville as a communist. At that time, I was based in Yorkshire. I'm often reprimanded for calling Starville a dirty commie bastard. He struck and negotiated with members out of work to the state where there wasn't a coal mine working in the country, and it was cheaper to import the coal from the town. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Martin Richmond.
Thank you, Chair. I would.
And that'll be it. That's the last.
Yes. Can you hear me? Right. Okay. I'll go over here so I can hear. Professor Butler, the question of the party-to-party relationships interests me. And I would like to know, taking the question back perhaps into your field a bit more in terms of domestic political developments, what the impact of a possible loss of the majority of the ANC would have on the ability of the ANC to drive that sort of relationship, especially with communist parties from other countries. So the majoritarian nature of South African politics changing, how will that interplay with that party-to-party relationship?
Thank you. Anthony, last round.
Okay. Those are all difficult. But I think on Zimbabwe, it seems to me that South Africa's position has been fairly consistent. And whether you like it or not, it hasn't varied very much between Mandela and Mbeki, Anti and Ramaphosa. Call it quiet diplomacy, whatever you wish to call it. But it suggests that there are underlying reasons why that's the strategy that the South African government and the ANC have pursued, rather than it being a product of the personality or intentions of a particular president. And I know there are people who've tried to explain this in many different ways. With BRICS, I don't think Zuma was, Ramaphosa was ever Zuma's right-hand man. I think they've never got on, never been close. Zuma was deceived into choosing Ramaphosa as his ANC deputy in 2012 through quite a complex process of that involved people like Herman Momanti and Brilliant Ashley, Secretary General. And one of the reasons that he became Zuma's deputy was that he appeared to have no constituency, that he was vulnerable to be removed at any time, in part because at the time when he became ANC deputy president, he was under investigation from a presidential commission of inquiry about the Marikana massacre, in which Zuma, in effect, held all of the cards. I think Ramaphosa has some interest in China, in part because it's a shame that Michael Spicer has gone. The Standard Bank, where Ramaphosa has been a shareholder for a long time on the board, was 25% of Standard Bank was bought by Chinese Industrial and Commercial Bank. The major Chinese investment actually in post-apartheid South Africa, and the Chinese banks also bought a stake in Ramaphosa's own investment vehicle, Shanduka. So the Chinese invested in him, and I think he has some interest in them, and which is sensible, I think, as a counterweight to other interests that are involved in Africa and in South Africa. The BRICS Development Bank, I think one thing that bankers always tell me is that if you have a bank that is suspected of being radical or novel, then it has to behave more conservatively than a normal bank in order to secure the confidence of financial markets. And I think that's right. I mean, it's an experience, for example, of when the French under Mitterrand nationalized a bank in France, that bank had to operate more conservatively than the private banks in order to counter those fears of imprudent behavior and risk. I don't know about the Central African Republic, and I'm surprised we haven't got to the bottom of that. But it's clearly a problem that's been developing in South African foreign policy, as it has been in domestic policy, that the state is used as an instrument of powerful businesses that have political representation, politically influential people who have been recruited to them. In part, that's why I was mentioning Black economic empowerment earlier. And I think it's fair to say that Ramaphosa is part of that system. So I've just said to you that a Chinese bank bought, I think again it was 25% of Shandu. They invested in him. So too did Glencore and Excalibur in the now famous notorious London transaction. So the political power of politicians like Ramaphosa results in a premium that they can acquire, whether it's from Chinese or from Western companies. Now, whether he recognizes that problem, I'm not sure. I mean, my sense is that one reason for talking about his union history, that for him, he's entirely dispassionate about the people he partners with. I don't think he's ideologically committed to doing business with Longmin or with Chinese companies or Russian companies. That's true, that was appalling, that 2013 episode. Was it John?
Yeah.
Yes, I think I'm not sure what global embarrassment at the UN looks like, to be quite honest. I think it's in the eye of the beholder to some extent. I think your point about intellectual capacity in the presidency, I think capacity more generally in the presidency is something that's taken Ramaphosa a surprisingly long time to address. So after spending a period as deputy president with the evident ambition of becoming president, you would think he would have a plan, and that when he arrived in union buildings in February 2018, that he would bring people with him. I think one part of the story is that people said no, that he thought there were people who would work for him, and he said, no, we won't. We don't want to be involved. But I think there is also an issue with his personality, his ability to drive a really complex project. A reform president is something that's out of his experience. It's out of the experience of all of us, really. And I don't think he's shown that he knows how to undertake that project. And I think that's right. The problem of the declining capability of the state, it affects not just the presidency and DIRCO, but the state more broadly. In fact, those are departments that are perhaps more coherent than the Department of Trade and Industry than others. And I think it's also right that he hasn't grasped that. He hasn't grasped what the fundamental issues are there. Scargill, yes, Scargill said he was a communist. And the one interesting thing is that he actually sat in on many of the Central Committee meetings of the National Union of Mine Workers. But he was linked to the Moscow, I forget the name of the mine workers, the Mine Union Federation, but he was a conduit for resources. And when Ramaphosa became Secretary General of the ANC, it looks like one part of the deal was that he handed over the NUM to the SACP in the form of Guillermo Lanti in particular. But again, that's not, I don't think Ramaphosa has any interest ideologically in the Communist Party. It was just a mechanism for personal advancement. That's my guess at what happened. Arthur. Yeah, I've been thinking about this. It's one of the things that I don't know. This is one of the reasons I can't answer my own question. But it's quite striking if you think about the possibilities of coalition politics as soon as 2024. Gosh, the possibilities for the differences between an ANC-EFF coalition and an ANC-DA Action SA coalition or whatever seem to be very stark when it comes to foreign policy. And I don't know, I really don't know what the situation would be. Chaotic, I would imagine.
More chaos.
Yeah.
Is that your last word on that?
That's my last word.
Well, Anthony, thank you very, very much for your address. John Matheson described it as, sorry, I better sit down. You can't see me. If anybody's out there. John.
I think it goes off.
Anyway, John described your address as insightful, and I'm sure we would all agree with that. So I want to thank you very much for coming and sharing your insights with our branch and our members here this evening. And I'd just like to hand you a small token of our appreciation. It's somebody dug up this tie.
Oh, no.
Extraordinary. But there's also some of Western Cape's best produce. So I hope you enjoy it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.